Welcome today to our meeting on advancement in the ladder rank in residence and adjunct series. I'm Craig Nelson. I'm chair of the Appointments and Promotions Committee. At the moment, I'm invisible. That was not intentional. I promise I'm not wearing a bathrobe, but we're having trouble getting the video to work along with the slides. So you can see the slides and I will do the presentation, and we hope to have time for questions. This is the third year we're doing this talk, and it's in part to try to improve communication of what's expected for advancement for our young faculty who are in the various series that have a research focus. So that's the ladder rank, in residence, and adjunct series. There are other things going on to also improve this communication. For example, the department currently has a workshop dealing with issues related to advancement, and one of the work groups specifically working on the issue of communication to the faculty. In addition, Dr. Crystal has been meeting with the assistant professors to talk about the principal focus is talking about development of K awards, but he tells me that in those meetings, questions come up about advancement, and it's another forum where faculty could get information about advancement. This talk is being recorded, and I think after the talk, Nick will be sending out an email with information about how to access the talk if you're interested. Next slide. In terms of methods of getting information, this is a list of our committee, and each of these individuals is actually located at a different site. They're very different now since most of them are at home, but are also individuals that you can talk with about what happens. And one of the advantages of talking with people on the committee is the committee certainly knows what the committee is using as criteria for advancement. Of course, another group are the, first of all, Dr. Crystal, who's the vice chair for research, but also the deputy vice chairs. They're another source of information. And at this point, I think we've done a pretty good job of having our committee and having the vice chair and deputy vice chairs, all of us are on the same page with respect to what's expected for promotion. Next slide. There are times when you may feel as though it's kind of you against the system, and I'm just putting up this statement to remind you that in fact it's in the interests of the department for young faculty to be successful. That's true for all of our faculty, but with respect to the research faculty, we're hopeful that as many of you as possible will do well and contribute to the research mission of the department. That's very much in the interests of the department. So I'm just saying that it's not just a matter of altruism. No, hopefully there's some of that too, but I think it's really in the interests of the department for you to do well. Next slide. This is a table that you may have seen previously. Several of us use this for explaining the nature of the series for advancement. The first column on the left is that's with the subheading professor, refers to ladder rank individuals. Actually, I don't believe we have any assistant professors in the ladder rank series. Our faculty with a research focus are either in residence or adjunct, and 24 of the 27 assistant professors are actually in the adjunct series. Next slide. This slide sort of gives you more of a breakdown of the specific series we're talking about today, the adjunct series and the in-residence series. And what you see is that for individuals in the adjunct series whose focus is research, both the adjunct faculty and the in-residence faculty have that research productivity is essential for both of these series. They differ in terms of whether the emphasis on teaching, professional competence, and university or public service. And we'll mention more about this as we go along. Next slide. The adjunct series requires, and this is directly from the handbook, requires excellence in at least one and preferably more than one of the following categories: research and creative work, teaching and mentoring, university and public service, and professional competence. Exceptional achievement in one area may compensate for less activity in another area. Balance in all four is not required. Actually, this is not quite the way it works in practice. If you declare, and with agreement with the faculty, that research and creative work is your principal focus, that's your principal focus. Next slide. And for most people in the adjunct series, like almost 100%, that means excellence in research. And one of the things that's important and isn't talked about very much, it seems to me, is that this issue of what your primary focus is, it's not something you select out of the blue or on your own. This is either an explicit or implicit agreement between you and your responsible chair. It could be the chair, but in most cases, the responsible vice chair or deputy vice chair that you're working with. And what I mean by that is that you're both deciding that research is going to be your primary focus. And where this can be important is when you're coming up for promotion, if it turns out that over time, your percent effort has shifted and you're doing more teaching, or focused on some other area, it's important that you and your responsible vice chair are in agreement about that. If in fact the vice chair still expects that your primary focus is research, we're going to be evaluating you on the basis of your research productivity. Even though you may have thought that you've gotten much more involved in teaching. So this is not terribly clear, it seems to me, in the handbook, but in fact, it's very important. Yes, I see you got a note from Christina, who's helping us today. If you have questions, you could enter them with the chat feature, and I'll try to stop at some point also to see whether there are questions along the way. Well, I think I've said enough about this agreement between you and the responsible vice chair. I think you all understand that if once you kind of declare that research is your principal focus, it's going to stay that way unless you and your vice chair come to a different agreement. Next slide. This is more a description about expectations for associate professors and professors directly from the handbook. And the reason I'm presenting some of this is as I think you're generally aware, the committee doesn't select criteria for advancement out of the blue. Most of the criteria we're using comes directly from university policies and the handbook. The handbook is a collection of and description of the university policy. So for associate professor, in order to be appointed or promoted to the rank of associate professor, you must exhibit evidence of excellence in all applicable criteria in your series. If research is a criterion, you must attain national recognition for independent contributions to research. Independence in research includes publication as first author in peer-reviewed journals, independent extramural research funding, and principal investigator status. For professor.
Great, it's John.
Yes.
It's not just first author, it's also senior author.
That's correct. This is directly from the handbook, and we're going to talk about that in a moment.
Good.
You are correct, though, that our emphasis is on both first author and senior author peer-reviewed publications. For appointment at the professor level, essentially, we're continuing to review the same areas. The professors require continued professional growth and excellence in teaching. For promotion of full professor rank, you should demonstrate national and international prominence related to research. Let's go to the next slide. And we're going to come back to one of the issues that John is addressing with respect to publications in just a moment. This is what the chair letter looks like, and the chair letter is generated first by the Appointments and Promotions Committee, and then goes to the chair for review and any changes, and then he certifies this letter. This, along with your packet, goes to the dean's office, and then for promotion, accelerations, change in series, your packet ultimately goes to CAP, the Committee on Academic Personnel. The exception there is that accelerations of 1 year only advance to the dean's office. They don't go on to CAP. Let's talk, but these are the 4 areas that are reviewed. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about teaching and mentoring activity. This is one area where there's a difference for in residence and adjunct faculty. In residence, the faculty are expected to carry a full teaching load. Adjunct faculty are not. However, almost all of our adjunct faculty are teaching to some extent. Next slide. I've added this. As you know, there are ratings for teaching, either in the form of teaching mentoring evaluations or from course evaluations or lectures. And we do evaluations. I think our system is not terribly precise, but we get a pretty good idea of how people are doing. Most of the faculty, in fact, appear to be very good teachers. Some people do a lot of teaching, a few don't do much teaching, and very few get negative comments. About a half dozen times out of 100 people per year, we may get negative comments, and if there's several negative comments, we take that seriously and are asked by the dean's office to come up with a plan of action. Next slide. For people in the adjunct series, some teaching is expected. At least our committee expects you'll be doing some teaching. the adjunct faculty will be doing less than folks in the Senate series. All forms of teaching, clinical supervision, didactic lectures, mentoring trainees are acceptable forms of teaching. A question about this recently came up about whether, well, do you have to be doing some didactic lectures? According to the Dean's office, you do not. All of these different forms of teaching are adequate to demonstrate that you are teaching. Next slide. And in addition, while in the adjunct series, your teaching is not considered essential, remember that if you want to think ahead, you do want to demonstrate that you're good at being an educator. At some point, most adjunct faculty change series. Typically, associate professors, once they've been promoted in the adjunct series, may consider a change in series to in residence. And so it's good to be demonstrating that you are a good educator. Next slide. This is the area, research and our creative activity, that's most important for actually both in residence faculty and the adjunct faculty with a research focus. It's especially important for the adjunct faculty. And I should add that our committee uses similar criteria for advancement, similar criteria in the research area for both in residence and adjunct faculty. Not all departments do that. On the other hand, we're not the only department that does that. And part of the logic, our logic at least, is that the adjunct faculty have the advantage of not having as much in the way of teaching and service requirements for the department to give them time to do research. But given that, we ought to have similar expectations for both the in-residence and adjunct faculty with respect to their research. It also becomes important, or can become important, when people do decide to do a change in series to in residence. At that point, you don't have to, in a sense, move backward. In other words, if you've cleared the hurdle, the research hurdle for in the research area, you're also clearing the research hurdle for being in the in residence series. What are the kinds of things that are reviewed? Well, the next slides just kind of expand each of these areas. The first two, next slide, productivity and independence, next slide, are again defined in the handbook in the following manner. Peer-reviewed publications are the main criteria by which your research productivity will be evaluated. First, authorship usually signifies the lead role in the conduct of research reported, as well as the primary responsibility for writing the paper. Senior or last authorship usually reflects the overall guidance of the research reported, as well as careful and frequent review of the manuscript. Hence, first or senior authorship helps to document your research independence. Next slide. The significance of research. This is actually a potentially a more difficult item to assess, and you can click on next slide. And we obviously try to avoid our own notions about what's significant research. What we're really talking about is this research that with federal funding, either from NIH or Department of Defense grant, or something equivalent. What's the impact factor of the journal that the findings are published in? What's the overall impact of the findings on the field? What do the reviewer letters say about the significance of the individual? So those would be the kinds of information that would relate to the question of the significance of research. Next slide. The collaborative, I broke this down a little bit more. We're trying to be as concrete as we can without going too far, since there are very few magic numbers in this area. But we do look at the total number of publications, and that may be it may reflect in addition to the work of the individual, it can reflect how many years of postdoc training the person had, whether the person is working with a very productive team and is being included on a lot of publications. It's not that that's a bad thing, it's a good thing, but it may not reflect the independent contributions of the individual. So as the handbook has indicated, first and senior author publications are given more emphasis. We also look at publications during the last cycle. The expectation would be that as you go along in your career, that your number of publications will increase. What we can also see is that as you go along in your career, you may have relatively more senior author publications and fewer first author publications. As mentioned, we're considering the impact of the journal and the reviewer's comments. You know, when you read somebody's review, letter of support, if they start to pick out actual findings you've made and indicate how that has influenced the field, that can be very persuasive and important. You know, if they say Dr. Smith's 2011 study of PTSD changed how we treat the disorder, well, they're probably going to give a little more detail than that, but that's an impressive kind of piece of information about the individual's work and their standing in the field. Next slide. Collaborative research is not a requirement. I think we all value collaborative research, and these days, if anything, it's more common, and also more common to see publications with longer lists of authors. Next slide. Let's talk just a little bit about peer-reviewed research support or grants. Next slide. We first of all make a distinction between the role of grants in academic advancement versus the funding of the individual's salary. Obviously, grants play an important role for researchers in terms of supporting their salary, but our committee and the advancement process looks at grants from a different perspective. So we let the responsible vice chair work out with you how your salary is funded. But from an academic perspective, we're still concerned about grants because they provide support for collection of data to test hypotheses that lead to the publication of original findings. We did have an individual a few years ago who had quite a number of publications, but had primarily been working in a fashion that someone with a K award might work. It was testing and data mining, data which had been collected by one of his mentors. Our expectation is that if our faculty candidate is developing developing independence as a researcher, they're going to be getting grants in order to support the process of doing research. And so grants are very important from that perspective. Grants are also important, and this, I think, becomes obvious at some point, but may not be obvious depending on your experience in this area. The process of grant peer review indicates how extramural experts value your work. Occasionally, this is an issue for folks. Obviously it's an issue if they can't get grants, but it's also an issue. You know what happens is your mentor may be working in fact, it's probably likely your mentor works in a somewhat similar area as you do, and your mentor may value that area quite highly. But it may be hard to test whether this is a view that is shared by a broader group of individuals. When you submit a grant for peer review to NIH or to an equivalent system in the VA, you're going to get information back from the reviewers of those grants about how they value this line of work you're proposing. In some cases, individuals have had several grants turned down, and at some point, this question of whether the area you're pursuing is really going to be fundable becomes a very important issue. So being able to secure grants through the peer review process gives all of us, our committee, CAP, an indication of how others outside of UCSF value your work. And finally, having a PI status on grants further reflects independence and leadership. Next slide. We do use this term, research leadership. I remember when Nancy Adler brought this up in one of our committee meetings, and Nancy, I'm not sure if it's original with you. A few things are original, but at least at the time, you reminded us of this important concept, and it's something we do think about. We view this as an overall assessment of productivity, independence, establishing recognition as an authority, and fostering the development of young investigators. So this is kind of an extension of the independence concept. Is this person leading a laboratory that's both producing original findings and helping in the development of other young investigators? At the associate professor level, we are looking for evidence that the candidate demonstrates research leadership and will be successful as an independent investigator. Next slide. I must say, I have mixed feelings about presenting this. On the one hand, there aren't, as I said before, there are few magic numbers when we're evaluating people. On the other hand, we know from faculty that you want as much transparency and concrete examples as we're able to give. So from that perspective, I'm providing this information, and other members of the committee may want to comment on it. Typically, research faculty starting off will have a K award or an equivalent VA award. I think increasingly we're seeing people doing several years of postdoc training, and it may be that they do that until they obtain a K award so that they're ready to start off on the faculty with a K award. That is not true for all people and is not a requirement, but we are expecting that early in the 6 or 8 years as an assistant professor that people will have a K award. We're expecting that for promotion, faculty will be making the next step and will be obtaining PI status on our awards, preferably an RO1 or a VA equivalent award, or some combination of awards. I think most people who are successfully promoted usually have a combination of awards as both a PI on an R award. They may be a PI on a foundation award. They may be a co-investigator on someone else's award. So it's pretty common these days for people to have several awards. The number of publications varies even more than the number of grants. There are some bench researchers, depending on the area, that have fewer publications, but they tend to be first or senior author publications and are in high impact journals, the journals that publish information for basic science. The number of publications for folks working in clinical research areas is usually higher, but in both areas, first and senior author publications are important. Next slide. Actually, let me just stop for a moment. Now I'm seeing one chat. My guess is that's Christina's comment. Do we have any other questions at this point? I'm going to finish talking about the rest of the chair letter, but since the research area is so important, if there are questions, now might be a good time to raise them. Would any of the committee like to embellish or extend what I've said?
This is John Rubenstein.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, with regard to the authorship and publications, generally in the basic science laboratories, the principal investigator, the faculty member, is almost never first author, or almost always last author. And the first authorship goes to the student or postdoc who's the primary researcher in that subject. So don't feel like you have to put yourself as first author when you have students or postdocs who are actually doing the work. The tradition in basic science is the contrary. You put yourself as last author.
John, is that true at the assistant professor level?
Yes,
also?
Absolutely. It's true as soon as you have students and postdocs in graduate programs and training at UCSF. The students and postdocs are going to be assuming they did the work. There can be cases where you have a student or postdoc who really failed, and the PI needs to get the paper published. In those rare instances, the PI would go first. In the case of a review article, often the PI is first. But on peer-reviewed basic science research, we tend to, or always, put ourselves last, and it's looked at askance by other faculty members if something like that doesn't happen. And I've seen that happen, and there's been criticism of the faculty member who didn't do it.
I think for some of us who are not basic scientists, when we look at the bibliography, often it begins with first author publications, and it may well be that those are from a time that a person was a postdoc and working on with some other person who was the actual PI. And so when you look at the bibliography, often it does start off with first author publications, but as you say, and it sometimes is not so obvious to us when they became an assistant professor. Of course, we can find that at some other place in the packet. But
the timing is not clear by the publication date, because You may finish your postdoc in 1991, and your paper from your postdoc may not be published till 1994, but you were an assistant professor beginning 1992.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, John, for your comment.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit about professional competence. This is the subheading for this. Professional competence can be confusing, especially to clinicians who I think expect, rightfully from the wording, that this essentially is asking, are you a competent physician or psychologist or mental health worker? And in fact, the items that we're asked to rate, which are listed below on this slide, things like awards that you've received, service to professional organization, for example, that you're on the council of the ACNP or you're president of some other organization, your service to journals or review as a reviewer or editor, presentation at national, international meetings, service to government agencies such as NIMH, and extramural reviewer comments are all things that we consider in this section. They mainly, and I think you can click on this slide, mainly reflect national or international recognition outside of the department. You can get an award within the department, but most of these other items reflect recognition outside the department. And for the research series, that recognition is important.
Craig, wouldn't a better label be professional stature or professional standing? Competence, I think you're right, has a different.
Well, this is just directly from, the UCSF.
Right.
And this is the heading they use. But and if not, well, we are not encouraged to change the actual language of the chair letter. It's at least hopefully important to explain to people what it refers to and by tradition has come to be. Did you have something else you wanted to? Why don't we go to the next slide?
Okay.
Next is university and public service. This area, again, for adjunct faculty is not a primary focus. And for people in the adjunct series, doing a lot of service to the university may not be that helpful for advancement. And, occasionally we'll ask someone in the adjunct series, especially if they're not being as productive as we think they could be, to kind of consider whether they're putting their time in the right area. On the other hand, a lack of service may interfere with advancement for latter rank and in residence faculty where service is expected. It also comes up when individuals are considering a change in series to in residence. If they've been doing very little service, that could be an issue. Usually it doesn't prohibit the advancement, but we make it pretty clear that the expectation with a change in series is that they're going to be much more active in terms of departmental and university service. Just a few things to mention in this area that I think sometimes people at the VA and San Francisco General wonder about where the committees they're on stand. They may be hospital committees, but generally, if it's within psychiatry at the VA or San Francisco General, those are considered departmental committees. The chair letter asks for service to the UC system. That's uncommon. and it does refer to the entire UC system. We do have some faculty who do participate in the overall UC system. Community service is pretty obvious and refers to volunteer service in the community. Government service, and that item I think is sometimes confusing for VA folks, and could be confusing for people at Langley Porter, since we're also government employees. But the intent here is to consider government service outside of the UC system. The common things that are being listed here are things like being on an NIH review panel, doing something for the Veterans Administration at the national level, or perhaps there are some people in our department who've been advisors or consultants to the state of California. That could be a consideration. Next slide.
Craig?
Yes.
I have a question about the last point. It seems like some of that is what you might have put down for professional competence. Do you want people to claim a single service twice?
We do actually include the information twice. Okay. Under service, service to national organizations, we mentioned both under professional competence and under the public service section. And service to NIMH is sort of duplicated in both of those sections. For promotion to full professor, we're not spending as much time on it. Most people, the hurdle for associate professor is higher. We're looking for evidence that people are going to be successful as independent investigators if we make the right decision about that advancement. These folks should do well. And most people who are associate professors get promoted to full professor. Essentially, what we're looking for there is an extension of their previous productivity. The same areas are reviewed. We may have kind of higher expectations. For example, UCSF requires international recognition. This can be reflected in reviewer letters or international presentations. I think one of the best things, of course, is if you've met an overseas collaborator that demonstrates that they know you and they've gotten to know you as an expert. That helps to kind of solidify this point. We're also looking for evidence that you become more of an authority in your field, and that can be reflected by not just reviewing for journals, but having an editorial position for a journal, kind of a higher level of service for organizations, being president of an organization, being on NIMH review panels. And finally, and very importantly, growth of mentorship, that you're demonstrating that you're training more and more postdocs. I think we're just about finished. Let's see the next slide. I think I'm going to skip this. We are doing a presentation next week on just preparing your CV, and you can either attend that or we have a document we're handing out that includes some do's and don'ts, and that you could look over. Next slide. And I'm anticipating that some of your questions might have to do with COVID. I think some of the things to know are that COVID has affected us all. We're all aware of it. The A&P committee, the Dean's Office, CAP, are aware of the situation. If your work has been affected and you want to file a personal statement, you may do that. This past year, of the people I reviewed, about a quarter of the individuals included a personal statement about how COVID has affected them. In some cases, where the investigators shifted their work to investigating COVID, they talked in positive terms. Certainly for most people, this has, the personal statement has reflected the difficulties they have had, ranging from, having their kids at home and helping them with their schoolwork, to having a study where research, patient enrollment was shut down. So these statements have varied considerably. We're frequently asked, well, should I submit a statement or not? We really can't tell you that. What we can tell you is you're welcome to submit a statement. It will not negatively affect your advancement, where there's not some macho thing going on that you're not supposed to admit to any, shortcomings, or you're not supposed to complain. That's not the issue. I think if you want to submit a statement, if you want us to know what has occurred, do so. Do so. It's not going to negatively impact you. And just last, I think the same thing, next slide, occurs to questions about maternity leave, those questions have been going on a little bit longer than the COVID statement. But some people during the past year have submitted a statement that included information about both COVID, maternity leave, or taking care of other family members who have difficulty because of COVID. There have been some changes this year, I think you're probably aware of, in terms of the stop the clock procedure, that the 8-year rule has been extended so that the stop the clock issue is sort of less important. For the adjunct series, there is no 8-year rule. We did ask the dean's office what they suggest about making some statement about maternity leave. The dean's office said their official position is that maternity leave is invisible in the advancement process. In other words, it's not really considered. But you can mention how your work has been affected. You could include it as a statement in the narrative section for research, or include a personal statement describing how it's affected your past year. And we recognize for some individuals it's not been just maternity leave, but there may have been additional complications or problems that have been may have been more extensive, serious, had bigger impact. Let's get to a few questions. I realize we're right near the end.
So Dr. Nelson, I can go ahead and summarize those for you. We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Both related to publications.
Okay.
The first, asking about, they understand that there are no strict cutoffs as it relates to the actual number of publications, but knowing a typical range would be very helpful. So do you have, when the AMP committee review publications at the assistant level, what is a successful number in your opinion? And then the second part of that question is, what are considered to be high impact journals?
In terms of numbers, the successful numbers, and just to give you one of the reasons why, it's a good example of why we're so hesitant to mention numbers. One person had 14 publications and was promoted. Another person had 75. The 75 for an assistant professor would be at the end of the spectrum and the skewed part of the distribution. I think most people doing clinical research on average these days, and remember the expectations are set by your peers. And we have a lot of really great investigators in our department. I would say on average, it's been, for clinical researchers, it's been 40 or more publications, but I'm talking now about total publications. First and senior author publications are obviously a reduced number. High impact journals are, refer to Science and Nature are, and the New England Journal of Medicine are very high impact journals. And you can, if you're interested in that, you can find that online in terms of the impact factor. It is true that in subspecialty areas where there just aren't as many researchers working, there aren't as many citations, and those subspecialty areas are kind of negatively affected by that. I just would add one more thing, and that is that when I said 40 total publications, and that might translate into 20 first or senior author publications, there are certainly people who are doing great work, who have had original findings that have had an impact in their area, where their total productivity may be less than that. So that shouldn't be viewed as an absolute hurdle. And we've already mentioned that in some areas we're expecting lower numbers of publications. And I'm seeing there's a question about acceleration. When should one apply? Actually, I have an answer for that. I think what you ought to do is to look at the acceleration form, and you can ask HR to send you that. It lists examples of reasons why you might request an acceleration. And you can use that form both to get some ideas of what might be a good reason. And then you can use that form to actually submit your request for an acceleration.
Great. And Dr. Newsom?
I think given the time, we're already over time.
Oh, we are. Yes.
So we should stop. Thank you for attending, and I hope you found this useful.